Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon. And today we have an excellent guest. She's the founder of the Women's Safety Initiative, and you'll have seen her all over the internet owning the libs. It is, of course, Jess Gill. How are you doing, Jess?
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
No worries. So I just wanted to ask first why you started this Women's Safety Initiative and what it's all about.
Yeah, it was a build up of multiple things, really. I think the peak of it was when it was a sunny day not too long ago. We've had amazing weather in the UK for once, and I decided to go on a picnic with my friend Elizabeth. And we must have been only out there for like a few hours in a relatively nice part of London. And the amount of times we were approached, certain people said weird things to us, it was ridiculous. So I got there a bit late, and already Elizabeth, she said that some guy had already approached her, and he was obviously foreign born. He was obviously not from here. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Like he wasn't like threatening her or anything. He was just like lingering around and asking her questions and not taking any like hints that she doesn't want to be bothered. And then we set up a picnic blanket and we were just sat there. There was loads of space around us. It was a relatively busy park, but we found like an area where it was a bit more quieter. And then this man, who was also foreign born, came up to us. And he didn't say anything to begin with. He just sat right next to the picnic blanket. And every time I looked round, he kept on staring at us. But he didn't say anything for like a whole 10, 15 minutes while he was there. And we were trying our best to ignore him. You know, we weren't doing anything, like, we weren't like smiling at him. We were just like obviously aware the situation's kind of uncomfortable and awkward. And then he finally starts to make conversation with us. Again, it's nothing like it's not making us feel unsafe, but it's one of those where it's like, can you not get the social cues here? Like, we obviously don't want to speak to you, we're not here to like, get hit on by some random guy. I'm just here to speak to my friend Elizabeth and make like, funny internet jokes to her in person, because that's what me and Liz always do. So that happened, and then he finally got the hint to leave, and then he left. And then after the picnic, we were walking to the shop, and there were just a bunch of like delivery Uber Eat drivers, and they were just like staring at us, and I felt like they were making comments about us, but in their native language. So obviously I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it just had that feeling because they were staring at us and in a certain way, and it just wasn't nice. And then I dropped Liz off at her bus stop, walked to my bus stop, and on the way there, I hear um I hear someone beeping on the road, which is weird because the it was a red light for the cars. And there was just like, a long list line of cars, so it's like, why would someone beep there? But again, I'm on the path. I'm not driving. I'm just a pedestrian, so I'm not really paying attention to it until it just like continues and continues. Someone continues to beep for like a good like 3-4 minutes, which like is a significant amount of time to just like continually press your horn. And then I look the other way, and it's this black guy who's staring at me, waving, trying to get my attention. And it's just like, why? Like, it just made me feel so uncomfortable. And then I wanted to rant to another friend about it, so I phoned my other friend, and they were like, "Yeah, I've had a similar experience today. I was out with a few friends, and we walked past a bus stop, and there were a bunch of men like." Leering and saying inappropriate stuff to a bunch of, I think they were schoolgirls. And it's just like, this issue is just so prevalent and no one speaks about it. So that was just the tipping point for me. I was like, something has to be done. I'm just fed up. I know I'm someone who's already in politics. I'm already aware of this. And this is just my experience. I dread to think what women all around the country are experiencing when it happens just so often to me. And, luckily I have a platform to call it out, but there are so many underrepresented cases where women just don't feel like they can speak about it, whether that's because they've been taught not to recognize these patterns, or alternatively they're worried if they do say something about it they'll get in trouble. So I started the Women's Safety Initiative with a couple of my friends, um, around the 16th of last month, and we received so much support. I was really worried that it would flop. I was worried like no one would pick it up, and I'd have to like fight to get women on board. I'd have to like go on the streets and knock on doors and stuff to try and get some women to speak about it. But they've just naturally come to us. So far, we have over 200 women who have signed up to our membership, just normal women who are concerned about these issues. And the stories that they give, it's heartbreaking. It's women from all different walks of life. There's we recently spoke to a grandmother who had to teach her kids about grooming, so they feel prepared because otherwise, like, what can she do? She's worried about their safety. We've got young girls, young women who want to do something good, so they've joined like a rape survivors helpline, and domestic violence and violence against women helplines and charities, and they've recognized this pattern. And then they've realized no one else dares to recognize this pattern, so they feel frustrated that, obviously there is a pattern, there is a trend when it comes to foreign born men being weird, being creepy, and at worst, grooming, raping, killing women, and no one speaks out about it. So we have women from all different walks of life. They're just normal women, and honestly, like, the bravery they've shown, the bravery to put their faces out, especially when, we live in such an era where when you just talk about these things, you are putting your career on the line. The fact that they're willing to speak out about it, it's just it's so inspiring.
All right. Well, I definitely want to get into the dangers of speaking out about it. But first, I wanted to ask. Well, by the way, a picnic is such a kind of perfect aesthetic. It's like old England versus UK aesthetics. Like you're trying to enjoy a picnic, but the Boris wave intrudes upon you. But we'll go into that. But have you noticed a recent uptick in this, or are you sort of too young that you've kind of always been like this?
Yeah, like, I don't have enough experience to say. I'm 21, um, and I come from one of the few nice places in Bolton, in Greater Manchester. They do exist, and so growing up, I didn't really experience anything like this, other than like when I did catch public transport. And again, it was normally ethnic minorities. I don't think it must be like one or two times maximum where I've been catcalled or stared at by a white British person. In all honesty, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I've just not experienced it, and from what I can tell, it's just not as common. And I'm not saying that white British men don't commit these crimes. Of course they do, but I think right now there is just this massive issue, and it is coming from ethnic minority men, realistically. So I've grown up in, I think it was majority white, British, my area, conservative voting party in the north. So I didn't really experience it as much. But again, like Bolton Town Centre, that's massively diverse, and it's even more and more diverse. And I feel like there was always an issue there. And again, just growing up, so like not so much Bolton, but the areas around Bolton in Greater Manchester. Obviously, the grooming gangs are just prevalent still to this day, and you just grow up with that culture around it, where like everyone knows about it, but nothing's really done about it. No one really says anything, which so much attention it demands so much attention considering it's the worst crime in this country. So that's just shocking. And then the Manchester Arena bombing, and I know that wasn't explicitly like towards young girls, but like who else did the terrorist think he was going to attack when he's going to an Ariana Grande concert? Like, he's obviously targeting the most vulnerable of our society. And I had, my cousin went to that concert. I had people at my school who were at that concert. No one got hurt that I know, thank God. But everyone was impacted by it. They offered therapy sessions the next day. At my local youth council, there was a girl who had PTSD from that. So just growing up in that era of, violence against women and girls because of this. And then finally, as well, there was a young girl, 7 years old, Emily Jones, her name is, and she was murdered by an Albanian woman. I think she came here legally. I can't remember specifically. But she just stabbed this 7-year-old girl in broad daylight while she was with her dad. And I think, she's in prison, but I think it was kind of, she was dealt with a bit less harshly because she claimed like mental health or something. And it's just shocking. It's just awful to see. And it's like, everyone in this country can probably name the name George Floyd. How many people can name the name Emily Jones? And that's just the biggest tragedy ever. And this is a park, Queen's Park it was at. And that was where me and my friends, we used to go on walks. We used to like get a milkshake at. at a local shop and then go to Queen's Park and just like swing on the swings. And now that image of that park has just been ruined because someone decided to do something which is the most awful thing in the world. And so just growing up in that culture, and then I moved to Reading a couple years back, and it was the same thing. I wouldn't feel safe on the street. I wouldn't go out at night unless I was with friends. If there was an option between going on like a 10-minute walk or a 2-minute bus, like obviously I'm able to walk, but I just wouldn't feel safe, so I would catch the bus. And just like getting worse and worse. I thought Reading was the worst of it, and then I moved to Tottenham, which is just awful. And even outside of Tottenham, even I've had men come up to me and call me all sorts in front of like Euston Station, for example. So it just seems to be everywhere. So it has seemed to be a growing problem, but I don't know whether that's because I've just been going out more as I've been getting older, or it has increased, and it's probably a bit of both.
Yeah, well, obviously, I'm a man, but I think it's massively increased in my lifetime. But I just wondered for you. And by the way, talking about London, yeah, I mean, even for me, I have to get the tube home at like 12 a.m. It's apocalyptic. It's like people with no shoes, chicken bones, and the end carried as beggars, screaming, violent. It's just like I just text my mates what's going on the tube, and they just can't believe. I'm documenting what I see, and it's just apocalyptic stuff every night that you couldn't make up. But one thing I've noticed you get a lot when you talk about this, there's two things. Obviously, there's being called racist, which we'll get onto. But the first one is not even. It's sort of almost pre that. It's you put up a tweet just as we record just today, and you're talking about walking home late at night and various harassment you received just in that one trip. And someone replies to you, "How do you know they were foreign born? Did you ask for their passports and birth certificates?" It seems like you didn't even speak to the first one, so I'm genuinely curious. I mean, this is the kind of disingenuous stuff, as if English and British people don't know who foreign born people are, or any country wouldn't know immediately, is completely absurd. But and of course, it's not just race; it's a specific it's language and a number of other obvious cultural signifiers. But what do you say to that when you get that kind of response?
I mean, everyone's British according to those kind of people. British to them it is just a passport, realistically, and even then, like I think they probably think that's a bit too conservative with that. I think, well, in that situation, yeah, like yesterday, and I didn't even think about posting it until I was just like, yeah, this is too much, because it wasn't really. I didn't. I felt unsafe, but they didn't do anything. If that makes sense, it was just antisocial behavior, and I don't know. Maybe it's just me being naive, but I think it should just be common sense not to approach a woman, um, when she's alone at like 11:30 p.m. But like they kept on like going up to me. Two cases. So on the tube, I was just there on the tube and this guy stared at me, and I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt first. I thought maybe he was just looking in my direction. Your eyes have to go somewhere. Maybe he was just looking forward. So then like I moved across and he was still staring at me. And I had to like pretend I didn't notice because I didn't want to escalate it or anything like that. And then I got off the tube, and I walked to the bus stop. And again, like he was like right next to me each time. And like I kept on like slowing down, speeding up, and he kept on staying there. And I tried to still like remain oblivious with my headphones on, even though like no music was coming out, because obviously I was a bit worried, just to give the impression that I couldn't see him, or didn't acknowledge it. So that was uncomfortable, and he was like speaking on the phone at one point for like a minute. I don't know what he was saying, but he was speaking in a foreign language. And again, like I know I know what a non-British person looks like. The same way I know what a Chinese person looks like, or a Japanese person, or even I don't know. You know what someone looks like based on their ethnicity. I don't like this idea that it's controversial to say that. And yeah, there might be some cases where it's wrong, and sure, whatever. But like, I think you can be 90% certain that someone is British or not, especially being from that country. You know where they are. Like, I have friends who are like Chinese and Japanese, and I can't tell the difference in all honesty, but they can tell the difference because they're Chinese or Japanese, and they can understand that distinction. So like this is a real thing, and I'm fed up with people pretending it's not. But I can tell they're foreign because they're speaking a different language. They don't look like they're from this country, and I don't think that should be controversial to say. Um, And it's just this ignorance of it, in the sense that I get so many comments not even acknowledging that this is an issue. They just call me racist for pointing it out, or they say this didn't happen. They say that um, they say that I'm making it up. They say, why don't you get evidence of it? Whereas these people, during the Me Too movement, I bet they were just so on board to just accuse anyone of anything if it's politically convenient for them. And now they're demanding, that when these situations arise, I get my phone out. And it's like, I'm not going to get my phone out because I don't want to escalate the situation. I don't want to, cause any more like concern. Like my concern at that moment is making sure that I'm safe. And, I think that's normal to do. I'm not being a journalist, or I'm not doing an investigation at that point. I'm just making sure that I can get home at the end of the night and nothing comes up. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, it's that kind of pics or it didn't happen mentality. Yeah, it's like you're thinking about safety, not filming it. But so the other thing you get a lot is, of course, you get accused of, if maybe not outright racism, sometimes you might, or just generally bringing up a kind of distasteful issue. So I saw you on GB News dealing with someone on this. You get a lot of these feminist, kind of male feminist midwits you have to deal with, and to me, it's kind of, I mean, maybe I shouldn't give my own view as the interviewer, but what do you do about those people? Because it's a kind of, the problem you have is it's a kind of low status thing. It's the same mentality that led to the grooming gangs being covered up, in my opinion. But it's, you're dealing with this, these people who get virtue points by saying, "Oh no, diversity is amazing," but they won't pay the price for it because often it's not great as a bloke either because you've got to go home. I don't even put my headphones in late at night in London. I'm like aware of stuff. Maybe you're more likely to get mugged or stabbed or beaten up, but it's not great as a bloke. But so it must be awful as a woman, and you just think, so it's not great as a bloke, but it's certainly a lot more. You feel a lot more safe, and so you go. They can just get their virtue points at your expense. That's my take on why it's disgusting. But how do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's interesting because again, these are the same people who are like during Black Lives Matter don't talk about this stuff unless you have that lived experience of it. And to be fair, to like Black Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff, I do think there is power in sharing your own experience of it, and that's what I want to emphasize with the Women's Safety Initiative. Because not to mention Stalin or whatever, but there is that quote like one story is a tragedy, a million stories are a statistic, and I think a lot of this class of liberals who go to university who live in a nice area of London, like the guy I was on GB News with debating. He said that he lived in Notting Hill before that, which is a very nice area of London, definitely compared to Tottenham. And then he wonders why he doesn't see anything like this. So I think that group of people, they have the privilege. It's a luxury belief. They don't have to face this, and it's just interesting because we were speaking behind the green room, in the green room, and he was saying like he has two daughters, and he was just like telling me a bit about himself, and the only reason why he goes to Tottenham is because of the football. And it's just like, is this really the Britain you want to see your daughters grow up in? It's a massive shame. Um, and so I think it is the reality that he doesn't have to face the facts, and also, he can say like, oh, everyone's equal, and if someone does commit a crime, it's not because of where they're from and the culture that they've come from. Creating like this way they view the world and view women in particular. It's just because Britain is oppressive, and individually it's the men individually, and we should focus on domestic violence and focus on violence in general, not the color of the skin. Like I was watching a debate with Matt Goodwin, and I think her name is Zoe Gardner, and it was really interesting. They must have found, the only people in this country who actually believe that mass immigration was a success, because in this room, like everyone was booing Matt Goodwin, and I was so taken aback by that because, like, I know that this worldview, that immigration has been a success, is a very, very unpopular opinion with the British public. I think the overwhelming majority, believe we should have some restrictions on immigration, and good percentage believe that immigration should be reversed entirely. It's not a controversial opinion, but in that debate, you know there were people in the audience like shaking their head, and when Goodwin referenced that, I think it's like Afghans are like 20 times more likely. to commit like sexual violence against women or something. Like they were like clutching their pearls, they were like really like triggered by it, and they couldn't face it. And then Zoe just said, oh, this is, it's diminishing, it's undermining the issue of sexual violence in general. And something that we did for the Women's Safety Initiative, um, I wrongly assumed that leftists could understand statistics because one of our posters said one in four. I think it's one in four sex crimes are committed by people foreign born, which is a lot. It means that if we didn't have the immigration policy we had, we could reduce sex crimes by 25%. Like, that's crazy. And also, like, just by per capita, they're overrepresenting. But they're like, oh, what about the other three, the other 75%? And it's just like, yeah, but like, what do you suggest we do about that? And something that really annoys me is that you see these adverts on the tube where it's like, stop staring at women, and upskirting is a crime, and touching women inappropriately is a crime. The people who do that already know, or they just don't care. Like, that isn't going to prevent anyone. But again, because we have this, it's this Marxist mindset that's even coming into the way we deal with this stuff, focusing on the oppressor and punishing the oppressor rather than, which they deem as men in general, rather than focusing on like actually helping victims. And that's why you have this really ineffective response. And it's like, realistically, as much as I hate to say it, like, there are going to be some awful people in this world, regardless, of what we do. The best we can do is deter it. And there are reasons why people do stuff, and I think, in the UK, I think men are a bit too scared to be masculine at all. And in that's in positive ways. Like, I think that's why we don't have the same culture as the men who are coming over here and going up to women and saying awful things to them, or saying being inappropriate to them. That's a positive. But at the same time, because they're so worried, and because they don't feel like a duty to be masculine anymore, because we've demonized that so much, they don't feel a responsibility to walk women home at night. They don't feel a responsibility to be there. And we've kind of designated that to the police. But now the police aren't there because, like, Black Lives Matter and everything defunding the police, and also just general failures in community policing and the decline in that. So now women have no one to turn to.
Yeah, it definitely feels like you've been abandoned by the state. It's very much like we saw with the grooming gangs in this state of a narco tyranny that we have. But what should the penalties be then? You talk about deterrence. Is it just a question of fixing immigration policy, or are there different deterrents that should be in place for this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think, well, with the Women's Safety Initiative, our focus is on immigration and the way that's impacted women. Um, Again, I'm not saying that's the only thing that's impacting women and women's violence. Obviously, domestic violence is a massive thing. But it's like, for example, I grew up in a domestically abusive household where the police came around like every few weeks because like there was something going on. And I know there is support there. I received a lot of support there. When that was happening, I received counselling. There was like a whole house dedicated to it. There were specialists trained in domestic abuse. There was like a refuge we could have gone to if we needed to. There was a lot of support around that. Obviously, the more the merrier. We need as much as we can do with that because we need to support, women and men as well, because men experience it as well. But we need to support victims in this situation. But at least there's something there. Whereas the grooming gangs, which I would say is, the epitome of this, is the peak example of this. There is no support there. Over the past month, I've spoken to victims of grooming gangs. I've spoken to the families of grooming gangs, and for something so awful, where girls are repeatedly being raped and sexually assaulted by multiple people, sometimes at the same time. Sometimes they've been kidnapped. Sometimes they've been drugged, chained to radiators. All this awful stuff, and also the mentality as well of being groomed, because a lot of these girls, sometimes they don't understand what's going on. They think they have a boyfriend, and then this awful things happen. And it's almost like, when speaking to some of these survivors and the families, they compared it to being in a cult, because they feel like they have a connection with this. person, which is awful, and you need to unwind that, and you need a certain therapy to get that. These girls still aren't getting any help. And bear in mind as well, like if these same girls said that they were like transgender, wanted to, make irreversible changes to their body, they would be on the waiting list straight away. They would get all the help they need. Whereas they go through this, and oftentimes, unless they can prove this happened to them, which, these are young girls who oftentimes don't have support systems, they don't get the help they need. So I know I've been on a bit of a tangent there, but I think, just providing a victim first approach and actually helping these girls, I think that's just so important. And that's the peak of it. It's like, that's not even to mention the day to day stuff that like I go through and my friends go through and women all across the country go through. Which obviously, like, I'm not saying I need therapy or anything like that, but if something does happen like that, I've not reported anything to the police. Even though I've experienced it on like almost a daily basis, because I just have no, I have no sense that the police will do anything about it. And what can they do about it? There's no real evidence there. I doubt it's been filmed or recorded, and it is sometimes it's just borderline creepy behavior. It's not necessarily a crime, but maybe I'm too optimistic in how society should be, and I don't think people should do that. I don't think, like I said, I don't think it's right to approach a young woman who's alone at 11:30 p.m. So there's that. And I think in terms of these guys, it's like, what do you expect when you import millions of working age men to this country, and they come from countries where it's just normal to treat women like this, where the femicide rate is extremely high. There's a reason behind that. Whatever the reason is, it's definitely there, and I feel like it's so, it's so obvious. And when I've spoken to my left wing friends about it, they just don't have an answer. They're like, oh, we should just treat all sexual harassment, but surely you should be wanting to get to the root cause of this. So, in all honesty, I just think, we do need to reverse it. I think a lot of these men should be sent back. I think we should have a cap. We should have a ban off these men coming to this country, unless perhaps if they definitely face certain requirements, there needs to be very strong vetting, because honestly, I don't think the rape of one woman is worth, having this liberal policy. And that's what's happening every single day. I think there's a rape every, like, is it like one every hour in London, I think. And obviously I'm not saying that's all foreign born men, but I think there's definitely a contribution to that. Like, there was an instance not too long ago where a woman was raped on the tube, and I just, you just hear these stories, and it's just so heartbreaking, and something needs to be done about it. And I know maybe it comes across as illiberal or cruel, but I think women's safety, and I don't say that like in a feminist way. I don't think it's even necessary to say it in a feminist way. I think we should all be for women, feeling safe on the streets, but I think that should be prioritized.
Yeah, and when you talk about it not being a clear law or no evidence, really you're talking about the decline of the high trust society. And we need laws when trust fails. And it would have been known in the past, don't harass a woman at 11:30. Obviously, some people would always do it, but far fewer. But now we've lost that, and there's no real way to police it, it sounds like you're saying, other than not letting people in the first place. So what about this question? You mentioned the trans thing briefly. Which is more of a threat? And there's been loads of attention on that and loads of campaigning. Of course, there was opposition at first to people raising that. So, which is more of a threat to women? These problems you're mentioning from immigration, or the trans issue?
I would say immigration by far. I actually came from, like, one of the first things that I ever focused on was the trans issue, because mostly just out of frustration than anything, because like it's obvious that a man who goes around saying he's a woman is not a woman. And it's obvious, like, growing up in that generation, I've had friends who have come from like broken households, and then they go like, oh, Jess, I think I'm transgender. And it's just like, you, no, you're not, you just need help, like actual like help, because they've gone through a lot. But the state has just like forced them to, go down this path, and that's the only way they can receive help. So obviously it's a massive issue. I'm not saying that, but I think in terms of the scale of it, um, you know, there is validity of being worried about men going into women's spaces, and I don't want to diminish that at all. However, I think in terms of the daily harassment women see, I think that is just a massive thing. And honestly, like, I know this sounds bad, but it does kind of frustrate me a tiny bit, because basically after WSI launched, it was just after the Supreme Court made their ruling about biological sex, and all the gender critical feminists were like parading that. And I said, okay, guys, like let's move on to immigration, which again I would argue is such like a bigger issue. Like, I'm not saying there isn't issues with that. I've made a documentary on that. I've been a part of these groups before, but I would just say it's a bigger issue impacting more women. And I just feel like these women who claim to be champions of of women's rights, and they've courage signaled. They've said like, "Oh, I'm so brave for sticking up against men who act as women," and it's just like, you know, I feel like being called transphobic isn't as it's not as stigmatizing as being called racist, in all honesty, and that's the accusation you get when talking about this. Whereas transphobic, it's a new term. It's not as it's not as severe. And I just look at a lot of these activists, and it's like, yeah, you probably did risk a lot. You probably did risk some sort of social pressure and some social stigma in your friendship group, especially if they are like middle class liberal women. Like, I'm not denying that, but at the same time, like I think it is probably a lot more controversial to mention the grooming gangs, for example, to mention, the fact that it is majority, or most of the time, it does seem to be majority ethnic minority people doing this on the streets. I feel like they're not facing that, and when you look at the grooming gangs and you look at these women who have called themselves, champions for women, and they're fighting for women's rights, and they're talking about this relatively niche issue, which again is an issue. I just think you should be paying more attention to the girls who are getting gang raped and groomed, and no one's doing anything about it. Like, I would say that's the biggest issue in Britain. So I hope they come to our side, and a lot of the women we've spoken to, they do feel annoyed with the trans stuff, and they've come from that originally. So I hope they do come around to this. But it is just a level of frustration, and again with the turf stuff, it's interesting because a lot of again, when you think of the grooming gangs, for example, maybe not recently, but when you thought of the grooming gangs, you probably thought of like Tommy Robinson and that working class aspect of it. And obviously, not. I'm not like publicly supporting Tommy Robinson. My feelings about Tommy Robinson, well, he's nuanced, right? And I think it's good that he raised awareness of it. But obviously, I disagree with some of his tactics, and the way he's gone about it. And also like with the working class, I feel like, and I say this as a working class person, I feel like we are a bit more rough with our language and a bit more politically incorrect. So I feel like that has been kind of dispelling for the middle class. Whereas the trans stuff, and realistically, like not all the time, but I would say when you think about the trans stuff and you think about these gender critical feminists and activists, they do come from a middle class background, and it's almost like in a way it's almost like a luxury belief for them because they don't have to see it as much as it's easy for them to talk about it a bit more than it's easy for them to talk about racism, not racism, than to be called racist and talk about these issues like the grooming gangs, and they can still get those bravery points. So it is kind of disappointing to see.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I mean, I made a joke. Obviously, it's an edgy topic, but I said if it's a pity that J.K. Rowling's so rich because if she just got stared at on the tube once, this would end because she's so effective when she gets involved. But the trick is getting those people involved. Like you say, it's a much harder issue for them to get involved in. I have seen tweets from Kelly J. Keane where I think, oh, she's getting it, and she seems to be very fearless and wouldn't be too worried about what she's called. And obviously, people like Alex Phillips, but she's already known as being on the right. But it's if you can get those people involved, do you see evidence that they you mentioned it a little bit, do you see evidence that they are coming across people like that, or is it still, are you still facing them going, I don't want to touch that?
Well, again, coming from having worked in that background, I think Kelly J. Keane is seen as kind of like a firebrand in that side, and she's seen as a bit more like radical than the rest of them. And I really like she's one of my favorites, gender critical. I don't think she calls herself a feminist. I'm not too sure,
I don't think
but
so anymore now.
yeah, women's advocates, let's just say. I really applaud her for saying that because again, and I think it's because of the roots. When you look at people like I don't know, like J.K. Rowling, I'm sure maybe I was a bit young to properly remember the story, but I'm sure she was advocating for like refugees before she was talking about all this trans stuff.
She's very
Like,
lefty on everything else.
yeah, and I think that's the thing. Like, it comes from a lot of these women. Um, they're not right wing. They come from left wing roots, and when they talk about the trans stuff, it comes from a place of misogyny. And it's like, no, I don't think that's the case. I think this, this trans stuff is just an extension of their own ideologies. It's an extension of liberalism. It's the extension of everyone's, equal, and you can just be whatever you want. And it's a product of your surroundings and growing up, and it's a product of the system. And it's just an extension of what they believe. Whereas if you come from a right wing background, the reason why these men aren't dressing up as women is not because they hate women. Maybe it's because they sexualize women a bit. I'm not denying that, but I don't think it's because it's from misogyny. I don't think they're trying to hate women around this, which is what like Julie Bindel might say. So I disagree with that. I think again it's an extension of liberalism, and it's an easy target for a lot of these women who are like fed up of how the left is acting. Maybe they think wokeness have gone too far, but again, they're an extension of that wokeness. Wokeness is is the child of liberalism, but they don't seem to see that, and they don't realize that if they don't reject that ideology entirely, it's just going to repeat itself.
Yeah. What slightly different question? What about are there any political parties right now that are addressing your concerns that you think will actually would do things to get this solved?
Um, Part of the reason why I created WSI, like it was during the whole Rupert Lowe reform situation.
All right, that is the end of the free episode. But if you want the full podcast, go to nickdixon.net for all the extra content, all my articles. That is my Substack, nickdixon.net. And we need your help to keep this whole thing going, keep the lights on, this amazing production, hiring people, etc. nickdixon.net to support us. It's £5 a month, which is about the cost of some sort of fancy latte in London, or there's a slight discount if you get the yearly option, or it's just £5 a month. So we'll see you on nickdixon.net, and thank you very much.